Welcome back to the Wednesday evening Bible study as we continue our study on the book of Revelation. I want to remind us that the last time we were together, we were finishing up with chapter 6. We began with chapter 7 for tonight and for this week. This is a good chapter for us for this week. So we're entering into the week that celebrates the passion of our Lord, celebrates the combination of that Passion Week of Christian celebration with the Jewish celebration of the Passover and all that that means. We'll talk about a little bit of that as we move forward with this study tonight together. One of the things I did want to do is just reiterate some of the stuff that we started with from this course, because we have a tendency sometimes maybe to hear something once and it doesn't really stick. And maybe there's a little bit of confusion that could breed a little bit later on because of not having a full understanding or a full memory of what was said before. So when you do Bible interpretation, it is important that we remember that you have to determine what type of literature you're reading. And in this particular case, we're reading apocalyptic literature. In Bible interpretation, when you determine what type of literature you're using, you realize that there are certain rules for interpreting said literature. And it is incumbent upon the reader to understand the rules of the game. It's kind of like in one of my Bible interpretation classes I shared from one of our textbooks that, if you're playing basketball and you pick the ball up, put it under your arm, and you just start running towards the goal, the referee will call you for a travel, and you will turn the ball over to the opposing team, and you will not gain points, but in fact you will lose the offensive and have to go back on defense. So because the game of football includes and carries out picking up the ball and putting it under your arm and running towards the goal line without bouncing it, that doesn't mean that all games that have a ball in it have the same rules. Basketball, you have to dribble, you have to bounce the ball while you're walking or running. Same thing in reverse. If you were to try to bounce a football as you ran towards the goal line, I don't know that it would necessarily be a penalty because of the rules of the game, but because of the way the football is shaped oblong, when you bounce it, it's going to bounce and roll in many different directions. You're not going to be able to keep control over it. And odds are, again, you're going to turn the ball over to the opposing team and go from being on offense to defense. So the goal of the game is to play the game according to the rules of the game. If you know the rules, you're benefited by it. In fact, there's been some times when golfers were playing golf, and if they would not have known the rules, they would have incurred a stroke or a penalty on themselves. But because they know the rules and they call the referee over, they get a ruling from the referee. And in fact, and indeed they were correct, they get a chance to have a free drop, move their ball to a better lie, or whatever the case may be. So it is really important when we're doing interpretation of any kind in literature, in English and grammar classes, or whatever, when you're if you have a literature class, or especially when you're reading the Bible, because the Bible is written in multiple different kinds of genres, and each genre has its own sort of rules for the game. So you must know those rules. Also, I want to remind us that when we're dealing with apocalyptic literature, that there's this idea of time being a cyclical thing or cycle. We talked about this last week. If you watched the video from last week, it's not a linear thing in the apocalyptic mind. In the Hebrew mind of the Old Testament, it was summer, fall, winter, spring, summer, fall, winter, spring, in a circular motion. And time, even though it may be headed somewhere, it's doing it in a circular way. So things happen and then they happen again. Sometimes it takes something being repeated. Things happen in a very, very familiar pattern in history. And the Hebrew people were really able to pick up on that and notice that. If you go back and you study the book of the Judges, each of the judges' cycles had very similar patterns. Israel would be obedient to God, they'd be blessed, they'd be living into the land, and then they would get fat, dumb, and lazy and happy, as the saying goes. They weren't so much paying attention to their worship of God. They were beginning to be a little bit greedy. Justice was being perverted in the land, and before you knew it, God had taken his hand of blessing off the land. A foreign power had come in and had begun to dominate them. They were under foreign oppression, and they couldn't understand why. And someone finally kind of had the bright idea, well, maybe God has allowed these people to come in from outside to because we weren't faithful. So they turned back to God. God would raise up a judge who would lead them through that period of time, lead them to worship God faithfully again, and God would miraculously come in and save them from this enemy. And then the cycle would repeat. It was wash, rinse, and repeat. It would happen again and again and again. So keep that in mind as we go through, because we talked about last week that some scholars believe that these sets of 7 judgments are not 21 judgments that will be poured out on earth. But they seem to be 7 judgments, and then the same 7 judgments are sort of recapitulated or said again. And each time these judgments are spoken of, it's sort of a ratcheting up of the tension that's building towards the climax of the final judgment, the ultimate judgment. And many scholars have seen that because of this circular way of thinking about judgment, that God has this judgment, these 7 judgments, whether it be 7 seals, 7 trumps, 7 bowls. The number 7 is a perfect number, and therefore the judgments in and of themselves are perfect judgment. And God judges each cyclical session. Each time God's people find themselves under totalitarianism or dictatorship, each time when God's people are finding themselves like these people who the book is being written to, under the Roman ruler who is demanding an allegiance to him as if he were God, then God steps in and God judges that nation eventually. When last week we talked about the leash being only so long, and when God allows that evil to run the length of that leash, just like the dog on the cartoon we talked about last week, when he gets to the edge of that leash, the limits of that leash, the leash usually jerks him back because he's running so hard and he doesn't think about the limits. God jerks back evil at the edge of the limit where he's laid a line in the sand. So this is where we're going to pick up tonight on chapter 7, and we're going to start talking about 144,000 of Israel that are sealed. We want to ask ourselves the question, who are these 144,000? Is this a literal number? Is this a symbolic number? Of course, by now you probably know that my predominant way of looking at and reading this book is symbolically, because, again, of the rules of the game. Apocalyptic literature is written in a highly symbolic language. It's not meant to be taken literally most of the time. Of course, there are some things that can be taken literal. John being caught up into heaven with an angel and seeing all the sights of heaven seems to be a literal thing. John doesn't see necessarily everything he sees, and the actual event itself is not symbolic of something else. John does seem to be caught up. He does seem to be in heaven. He does seem to be with angel. But even in that, he does see some things that are symbolic, like 24 elders. What is representative of the 24 elders? We've already talked about this, but 12 and 12, right? Old Testament people of God, the New Testament people of God are symbolic, are symbolized by the 12 tribes, the 12 disciples, and that's the people who are closer to God's throne than the 4 and 20, or the 4 elders, or the 4 beasts, the creation itself, humans, lions, tigers and bears, oh my, just the creation itself, eagles, bulls, lions, and people. The 24 elders seem to be the church, or the Old Testament people of God in Judaism, and the church in the New Testament. Well, we're going to talk about that again in this chapter because of who these 144,000 seem to be. So let's look at this in chapter 7 and verse 1. Now, if you remember, we just ended up the last chapter with this. Fall on us and hide us from the face of the one who is seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of his wrath has come, and who will be able to stand? The sixth seal has been opened. We're about to open the seventh seal. It seems like judgment is going to be over. God is there. He's on his throne. The people who are going to be judged by him are fleeing and hiding in caves and rocks and cliffs and places like in crevices in the earth. And it says, fall on us, even in the cave. He wants the cave to fall in on themselves so that they can be hidden from the face of the great one who sits on the throne, God, who's going to judge them. But before that happens, something else happens. After this, I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth so that no wind could blow on earth or sea or against any tree. Now, in the book of Daniel, it talks about the winds of God, the 4 winds of the earth, 4 corners of the earth, blowing across the sea and whipping up the sea. And from the whipping of the sea, the foment of the sea, beasts arise. Well, it seems like the angels have stopped that now. There's a pause. Something is happening here. There's no time for chaos right this moment. This moment is sort of sacrosanct. It's like everybody takes a pause for just a second. And so while that's happening, here's what happens. Another angel in verse 2 saw another angel ascending from the rising of the sun, having the seal of the living God. And he called with a loud voice to the 4 angels who had been given the power to damage the earth and the sea, saying, don't damage the earth or the sea or the trees until we've marked the servants of our God with a seal on their foreheads. And I heard the number of those who were sealed, 144,000, sealed out of every tribe of the people of Israel. Now let's stop right there for a minute, and I want you to hold on to that. Let's go back for a second. What's being done here? God's angel is coming with the seal of God, and he's going to put some type of seal on these people who are going to be sort of under God's protection to a degree. What seems to be being drawn on from the Old Testament is 2 Old Testament passages that you should be very familiar with. I started this lesson by saying that tonight we would talk a little bit about the Passover. And if you remember when God poured out the plagues upon Egypt in the Old Testament, there was 10 plagues. And the people of Israel seemed to be spared from each of those plagues. They did not get the boils on their bodies like the Egyptians did. They didn't seem to be affected by the hail, fire, and the stones that fell from heaven, and hail and fire. They were not affected by the locusts and all the other things as bad as the Egyptians were. Seemed like God had kind of sequestered them. And some scholars have suggested that, where Israel lived at was maybe partly the reason why God had kind of sequestered them over to the side. Quarantined is a good word for what we're going through right now. God had quarantined them from the plague. They were up in Goshen, near the Mediterranean Sea. All of the bad plagues was going on a little bit farther south in the mainland in Egypt. So the Hebrew people were not suffering from the plagues that the Egyptians were suffering from. But the last plague was the death angel that was going to go through Egypt, and it was going to kill all firstborn in Egypt. And the Hebrews were even susceptible to this plague. If you did not have a seal on your house, then the angel could quite readily come into your home and take the firstborn's life. So they put blood of the lamb, the Passover lamb that was slain for the celebration of the Passover. They put that blood of that animal on the doorposts and the top or the lintel over the door. So all around the door was the blood of this lamb, this Passover lamb. And that's where we get the term Passover, because God said, when the death angel comes through the land of Egypt tonight, if you have this seal on your house, you're sealed as God's people, then the death angel sees that seal and he moves on, and he doesn't molest or bother you or your household. So you will not be susceptible to the plague because of the seal of God that is upon you. So that's one of the Old Testament narratives that's being drawn on, and we start talking about here God's people being sealed in a certain way for a certain thing. But there's another one, and that's Ezekiel chapter 9. And I'd like to look at that, actually. I was not going to read it, but I think we should, because this is probably one you're not as familiar with. I would expect you to be highly familiar with the Passover, so we shouldn't have to go back and read that. But chapter 9 of Ezekiel is also very important for the book of Revelation, and the theory or the interpretation of the book of Revelation that I'm going to be sharing with you throughout this study. And I hope that you'll be able to see what's really going on in this book, what this book is really all about, because there's been so much information and / misinformation, and even sometimes fear for people to read the book of Revelation, and it ought not be. The message is clear, although there's good people who disagree on specifics and certain interpretations. The overarching message is pretty clear. The book of Revelation is about who are you going to worship. Are you going to worship Jesus Christ and let him be the Lord of your life, or are you going to worship anything else? And in the book of Revelation specifically, that anything else happens to be the Caesar, the Roman Empire, and earthly politics. And the same thing can be held true for us today. In anything that we try to put before God becomes idolatry. And that's what the book of Revelation really is ultimately all about. Are you going to worship God or some other idol that is vying for your attention and for your loyalty and for your allegiance? So in the Old Testament book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel sees a vision of what's about to happen to the people who had been left in the land in Jerusalem, while he and the others who had gone into the first deportation into Babylonian captivity in 597, 587, 10 short years later, God is going to come back into the land and allow the Babylonians to take over the rest of the land. And in fact, they're going to destroy the city, destroy the temple, and take away the rest of the Hebrews, for the most part, and carry them all over to Babylon into exile. But before that happens, Ezekiel sees this event, chapter 9, and God is about to let the Babylonian Empire come in and destroy the city. But Ezekiel sees the spiritual behind the scenes. He doesn't see, he's not describing to them the Babylonian army coming and destroying. He's describing what God is doing to use the Babylonian army to punish the Hebrew people in Judah and bring them into Babylonian captivity. So it is ultimately God who is doing the leading here in the punishment that's being poured out, although God is using the Babylonian army to do it. The spiritual that Ezekiel can see in his vision is carried out by angels or destroying entities that God sends. But in reality, the people in Jerusalem are seeing and experiencing this as war between them and the Babylonians. The Babylonians are going to be the ones swinging the sword physically. But Ezekiel sees that behind the scenes, it is God who is the one who is manipulating the angels to, execute with judgment and the sword. So here's what it says. Then he cried in my hearing with a loud voice, saying, "Draw near, you executioners, to the city, each with his destroying weapon in his hand." And 6 men came from the direction of the upper gate, which faces to the north. The north and northeast of Israel is where Babylon was. So if they're coming from the north, they're coming from Babylon. And 6 is the number in apocalyptic that oftentimes is the number for man, because humanity was made on the 6th day of creation. So 6 gets kind of connected with the idea of man. So what he's saying here is that 6 men, he sees them as destroying angels, but it's the Babylonian army. It's literally men who are coming from the northern regions of Babylon towards Jerusalem with slaughtering weapons in their hand. But also there was another one, the seventh one, right? There were six, but among them was a man clothed with linen, with a writing case by his side. They went in and they stood beside the bronze altar. And the glory of God of Israel had come up from the cherub on which it rested on the threshold of the house. The Lord called to the man clothed in linen, who had the writing case by his side. Now let's stop right there for just a second. Who is this man clothed in linen? A linen ephod or a linen tunic was probably symbolic of what a priest would wear, right? So this person is almost like somebody who's on behalf of God and on behalf of the people. He's the person who goes between God and the people. And he has a inkhorn and a stamper. It's kind of like one of those things that maybe you used to have when you were a kid. Might even have got it in like a thing of Frosty Flakes or something like that. There's the little toy in the bottom. It's one of those little stampers with an ink thing, and you get it on the ink, and then you stamp it, and it leaves its imprint wherever you stamp it at, right? That's what this guy has. He's got a thing that he holds in his hand. It's maybe a seal of some kind. He's got a well full of ink, dips it into there, and he stamps it on whatever he's going to be stamping it on. Some scholars have said this is a theophany in the Old Testament, an appearance of God in the flesh, and therefore this would be the second person of the Trinity. That's a possibility. This could be Jesus. It's not called Jesus, not used in his name, because that would be anachronistic. In the New Testament, Jesus is named Jesus. In the Old Testament, Jesus appears, or God appears in the second person of the Trinity in incarnation in several different places. So this could very well be Jesus. And it makes sense because Jesus is usually the one who would go between God and man, right? So this person, this angel, this messenger of God, goes through with the stamp and the inkhorn at God's instruction. And God says this, verse 4. God said to him, go through the city, through Jerusalem, put a mark on the foreheads. Keep that in your mind. Don't forget that. Put a mark on the forehead of those who sigh and groan all over the abominations that are committed in this city. To the others, the other 5 destroying men, he said in my hearing, pass through the city after him and kill. Your eye shall not spare, and you shall not show pity. Cut down old men, young women, little children, women, but do not touch anyone who has that mark on their forehead. And begin at my sanctuary. So they began with the elders who were in front of the house. Then he said to them, defile the house, fill the courts with slain, go. So they went and they killed in the city. And while they were killing, and I was left alone, this is Ezekiel, he says, I fell prostrate down on my face in front of God, crying out, Lord God, will you destroy all who remain in Israel as you pour out your wrath upon Jerusalem? And he said to me, the guilt of the house of Israel and Judah is exceedingly great. The land is full of bloodshed, and the city full of perversity, for they said, the Lord has forsaken this land. The Lord does not see. As for me, my eye will not spare, nor will I have pity, but I will bring down their deeds upon their head. The man clothed in linen, with the writing case by his side, brought back word saying, I have done as you have commanded. So what is Ezekiel seeing? He's seeing God going through the city in the person of this linen-clad man with their inkhorn and the stamp. And he's putting a seal on God's faithful people, the ones who sigh and groan at the wickedness that's happening. Even when a society has become so wicked that you as a person may feel like there's nothing you can do to make a positive change. Like even today, maybe we think, abortion or some other sin that we are so saddened about is so great, so huge, that we often feel like even if we lift our voice, and we do lift our voice, but even when we lift our voice against it, nothing changes. A million babies will be taken by abortion again every year. And there's sometimes it feels like an exasperated, I don't know what I can do. I don't feel like I can make a difference. But God still sees those people who recognize that that's wrong and who weep about it, who mourn about it, who are sad and don't take any joy or glee in it. Those are the people of God. God's people are sealed with God's hand. When the Babylonians finally came into Jerusalem, they did not run through the city streets and pull the hair back on the bangs of each individual and say, do you have that mark? Can I kill you or can I not kill you? Because God's marked certain people for us not to kill. It's not how it worked. The mark was not a literal mark, just like the 6 angels were not physically, you couldn't see them. The people in Israel could not see them. They might have been there. They were spiritual. But nobody could see them but Ezekiel, who was granted a revelation or a vision to see the spiritual. The people only saw the Babylonians coming in, and the Babylonians only saw their foe. They only saw the enemy. And they went through killing indiscriminately, but what Ezekiel was trying to say is that in that indiscriminate killing of the Babylonians over the Hebrew people and the destruction of the Jerusalem, the capital, and the temple and everything, that God was going to supernaturally sequester, quarantine, hide, put behind the door with the blood on the post and the lintel of those who were sad about wickedness, those who had tried to raise their voice, who had preached against it, who said, we're going the wrong direction, we need to turn back. They will be spared from the killing, but they won't be spared from some punishment, because the Babylonians are still going to take the ones who are alive and carry them away in exile. So they're going to end up in exile. When John, getting back now to the New Testament in Revelation, when John says, I saw another angel just before the 7th seal was opened, like all the creation has started feeling the horses of the apocalypse, right? The famine, the war, the death, the pestilence, all of this stuff is starting to happen. Those are the beginnings of judgment, the beginnings of sorrow. We get to number 6 and the people cry out, oh my goodness, it's finally here, the judgment. Please hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne. And again, this message is just like in Ezekiel 9. God says, stop. Everything stop for a minute. Before the destruction happens, I want my angel to go through and I want him to mark on their forehead anyone who is my people. Okay? Now, that being said, let's look at who get marked, because it looks like only Jews are getting marked. From the tribe of Judah, 12,000 sealed. Tribe of Reuben, 12,000 sealed. From the tribe of Gad, 12,000. From the tribe of Asher, 12,000. And I'm not going to read all these because you can read it, but from each tribe of the 12 tribes of Israel, 12,000 sealed. Now, we get to verse 9. Let's stop there for just a second. Ask, who are these people who are being sealed by God? Scholars suggest that this is probably all the people who have been faithful to God from Genesis all the way through our generation and into the future until God finally consummates all of human history. And it's not meant to be. 144,000 and no more sealed by God. This seal is probably, likely, and I would suggest is no more a physical mark on you than the Hebrew author of Ezekiel saw on the people in Jerusalem. Ezekiel saw them marked. Oh, and by the way, this is something that was really interesting I forgot to share with you. When Ezekiel said they were marked in their forehead, the Hebrew letter that they were marked with was Tav. And it is the letter that transliterates into English a T. And that's not really significant to the Old Testament people so much. I mean, they're marked on the forehead with a T. But for Christians, a lowercase t is a cross. And so there's a cross on their foreheads, so to speak. It's in Hebrew, so it would look a little different. But for us, the interpretation is, obviously, as we look back, a cross on their forehead. Again, if this is Jesus, that is the marking individual, the one who's going through the land marking in the linen ephod, then it makes sense. And it's probably why a lot of churches, when they do Ash Wednesday, mark with the cross in the ashes on their forehead. Now, back to Revelation. 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes. Why do you think that that's not a literal number? Well, 12 is just too highly a symbolic number, and apocalyptic literature is a symbolic literature. To know the rules of the game, as we started off this study tonight, you know that the rules of the game of apocalypse is to take most of it symbolically. Very rarely is it something that is in this book that is meant to be taken very literally and to be this and never that. 12 is the Old Testament number of tribes that represent all the Old Testament people of God. 12 is also the number of disciples that Jesus brought together in his little movement for 3 years to sort of recapitulate the Old Testament people of God. And he brought out of that the church, that is us. So the 12 disciples represent the New Testament people of God. The number 10, as we have studied in this book already, is the number of absolute completeness. And when you multiply 10 times itself again, that's 3 times. The number 3 is usually for the Trinity, but it also carries this idea somewhat of a completeness. So 10 times 10 times 10 is 1,000. 10 times 10 is 100, times 10 is another 1,000. And so 12 Old Testament saints, 12 New Testament saints that represent all of the people of God, multiply 12 times 12, it's 144. Multiply that times 10 times 10 times 10, and now you've got 144,000. Now, this is where some denominations have gone wrong, because they've said, well, here it says it in the Bible, right here in Revelation. You got to take the Bible literally. The Bible says 144,000 people are going to heaven, so you better hope you're one of them. 143,999 will not make it in. Only 144,000. 144,001 will not make it in. Only 144,000. And that's just ridiculous if you think about it. Throughout time and eternity, there's been a lot more people who are righteous that will make it into God's kingdom than exactly 144,000 and no more. This is not meant to be taken that way. And here's how we can probably know that. Because the very next verse. Look at chapter 7, verse 9. After this, I looked, and there was a great multitude that no one could number from every nation, from all tribes, and all peoples, and all languages, standing before the throne, before the Lamb, robed in white, with palm branches in their hand. And they cried out in a loud voice, saying, Salvation belongs to our God, who is seated on the throne, and to his Lamb. Now let's stop there before we go to verse 11 and just go back. I want to try to reiterate what's being said here. The people of God now include all the Old Testament people who were faithful up to Jesus and all the New Testament people who are faithful in Jesus. I want you to turn over to Revelation 14 if you're reading your Bible and studying with me, not just listening. Revelation chapter 14 says this. Then I looked, and there was with the Lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him were 144,000 who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. So who are the ones who are standing with the Lamb on chapter 14, verse 1 on the Temple Mount, on Mount Zion? And why do they have God's name and Jesus' name stamped on their forehead? It seems to be that they are these that we've just talked about, these 144,000. And it seems to also be that chapter 12 or chapter 14 is again a symbolic number representing all the people who have followed God and trusted in Yahweh in the Old Testament, looking forward to Jesus, and trusted in Jesus once Jesus came and revealed to us the new covenant. This is why chapter 14 says the 144,000 have both the Father's name, Yahweh's name, and Jesus' name stamped on their foreheads. It is the people of God in the Old Testament who only knew God by Yahweh, didn't know a Jesus, hadn't come yet. But also the people of God in the New Testament who did know Jesus, and that's how they know Yahweh, is through Jesus. These are the people of God who've been sealed by God to be ultimately okay. That does not mean that we will not face judgment. It does not mean that we will not sometimes die martyr's death. If there's anything we've learned about this book already, we know it means that sometimes we will die martyr's death. So many of us, if we're faithful, when the time comes, we'll have to go that route. But it also doesn't mean you have to be a martyr to be among these 144,000. It just means that you have to be one who's trusted in God and put your faith in him. And if you put your faith in God, then you're marked. If you're one of the ones who woes and sorrows and mourns for the wickedness in the land and wishes things were better, wishes things were right, and wishes things were under God's complete control now, you're one of the people of God. That sorrow is the deep-seated spirit of God that lives within you, that's crying out for justice and for righteousness and the goodness of the Lord. And that's why you're one of his. You're sealed. The New Testament also talks about God's people being sealed with the Holy Spirit. It also talks about us being sealed by the Holy Spirit in the act of baptism. So in the church, part of our sealing is when we are sealed by baptism into Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit of God comes to live in our life. And that is part of that seal that is put upon us. So I don't want you to read this and get squirrely or weirded out and say, well, here's the Bible, and it says that only 144,000 people will be able to be with God. That's not what's going on here. This is highly symbolic. It is about the people of God being marked. And again, not even for being able to get through the tribulation or the judgment period without having to suffer physical death. It is that the physical death that we might suffer as martyrdom, or just when we finally do die from old age, has no power over us. The seal protects us from the power of death and the grave and hell. We are going to be in God's presence. And so that's why verse 9 says, after all these have been sealed, when we turn back to the vision that he's seeing in heaven, and time is different in heaven than it is on earth, he already sees the what's going to be in the future when everyone stands before God's throne. And it's all these people, anyone who has been faithful and trusted in God. They are every tribe, every nation, every tongue. Two more verses to kind of bear this out. Turn back to Galatians real quick. Chapter 3, verse 28 and 29. This is Galatians chapter 3, verse 28 and 29. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave nor free. There is no longer male nor female, for all of you are one in Christ. And if you belong to Christ, you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. So that's one passage in the New Testament that teaches us that we are a part of the heirs of God that go along with the Old Testament people of God. We are children of Abraham. We're grafted in, Paul says in Romans, to the original root of Judaism as a wild olive plant is grafted into a trained olive plant. We Gentiles are grafted into the faith by Jesus Christ, by the new covenant God had already established with the Hebrew people. All right, one more passage, and that is 1 Peter chapter 2 in verse 9 and 10. You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of him who has called you out of darkness into the marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Beloved, I urge you as aliens and exiles to abstain from the desires of the flesh that wage war against the soul. So basically he's saying here that we were once not a part of the people of God as Gentiles. But as Gentiles, we have been grafted in and now have become a part of that royal priesthood that is the people of Israel in the Old Testament. And the church carries on that narrative or that lineage. So I think this is very clearly then not literally 12,000 Jews from every tribe that are born and bred in the bloodline of Abraham only. And again, verse 9 seems to bear that out. After they've all been sealed, when he looks at them standing before the throne, it is every tribe, every nation, every people, every language. And they're waving palm branches, which is, again, very appropriate for the week that we just celebrated. And they're hollering out, Hosanna, or salvation belongs to God and to his throne who is seated, and to his Lamb who is seated on the throne with him. All right, verse 11. All the angels stood around the throne and around the elders and four living creatures, and they fell on their faces and before the throne and worshiped God. So all of creation joins in the worship of God when God's people worship God, when we sing his glory. And this is what the worship is for God, for all of creation, and for us as his people when we lead worship. And everything sort of resonates with that worship, all of creation around us. Verse 12, singing, Amen. Blessing and glory and wisdom and thanksgiving and honor and power and might. You go back through and read that list again, you count them off again, 7. This is the sevenfold worship of God that gives him 7 characteristics of honor, glory, thanksgiving, power, might. Again, that number 7 is a perfect number, right? So God is being given by his people and even by creation all glory, all honor, and all power is his because, again, that number 7 symbolizes that he's worthy of it. Verse 13. Then one of the elders asked me, saying, Who are these robed in white, and where have they come from? And I said to him, Sir, you are the one who knows this. Then he said to me, These are they who have come from the great ordeal, or who have come from and out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and have made themselves white in the blood of the Lamb. Now, when we hear that word tribulation, because of a certain way that Revelation has been taught in the past 100 years, maybe 200, we hear a 7-year trial and tribulation period that happens after the rapture, and that's kind of what gets stuck in our mind. But just for a moment, I just want you to hold back on that and read this passage for what it's actually trying to say to us. Who are these people? All these people, 12 and 12 times 1,000, times 10, times 10, times 10, all the perfect number of all the people of God from Old Testament, New Testament, all the way to the end of time. They're all people who have come through great tribulations. Jesus said, in this world, if you trust and you believe in me, you will, not might, but will, have great tribulation. This is not just the 12,000 people who made it through the great tribulation at the end of all times. This is all people of all generations who are faithful to God and follow God, been marked by God, blessed by God, sealed by God, and have come through whatever tribulations they've had to endure and go through, and some more than others. And this is the key thing. They made their robes white because they trusted in Jesus. They made their robes white by the blood of the Lamb. They've washed their robes and made their robes white by the blood of the Lamb. It is the Lamb's blood that makes us righteous to be in his presence. Whether we died of old age, whether we died of a heart attack, whether we died of an accident, whether we died of martyrdom, all people who have trusted in God, made their robes white in Jesus' blood, they will be with God in the end of all things. When we are not with God, we are in an exile from God. So look at verse 15 through the end of this chapter. For this reason, they are before the throne of God and worship him day and night within his temple. They've come back to the temple, right? Now remember, a lot of this is taken from Old Testament imagery. And in the Old Testament, when people were away from the temple, it was because they were taken away from it into Babylonian captivity. The temple was destroyed. It's when they came back home from Babylonian captivity that they were back in the temple worshiping God again. While they were away, they felt like they were oppressed. The people who were around them mocked them for their faith. They didn't allow them to exercise and engage in their faith. They felt like they were under the same type of exile that the Hebrews were under in the Egyptian, if you remember all the way back to Egypt. What were the conditions that the people worked in Egypt? They were hot because they toiled under the desert sun every day with no shade. They were tired because they worked them until they died. They never gave them much rest. They didn't get to enjoy the toils of their labor. They were usually hungry and they were usually thirsty. And when they went out into the wilderness, they still had all of those things on their way to the promised land. Promised land is a land that flows with milk and honey. It's a land that promises plenty of food. It promises shade. Every person can lay in the shade of their own fig tree and eat figs off their tree. You're going to have a place to worship God. You can rest. You can benefit from the toils of your own labor. The promised land is where you want to be. Exile and being in a foreign land is where you don't want to be. And that's where you're treated poorly. That's where you're mistreated. That's where the sun beats down on your back and is hot. Well, listen to this in remembrance of all of that. For this reason, they worship him day and night within his temple, and the one who is seated on the throne will shelter them. They will hunger no more thirst. The sun will not strike them with scorching heat. For the Lamb at the center of his throne will be now their shepherd, and he will guide them to springs of water of life, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Now, why do we make this elaborate thought about them being in exile in Babylon, exile in Egypt, and how these people were mistreated in their exiles, and the desire is to get back home to the temple? Is that really what's going on here? Well, let's look at Isaiah chapter 28. And let's remember that when, 25, and chapter 25, verse 8. And let's remember when the people were brought out of Egypt in Exodus, that while they were hot and nasty and tired and hungry, God provided for them a shepherd in Moses. And Moses led them through the wilderness to find food, to find shelter, and to find water, most importantly. In fact, that's why he ends up not being able to go into the promised land himself. If you remember, he struck the rock instead of just speaking to it out of anger. But let's look at chapter 25 of Isaiah. If you look at this chapter and you read it in its context, it is a prayer for deliverance from oppression while the people are being oppressed in foreign lands. It is exile and the people of exile that we can't stand. And it is, the symbolism is hungry, tired, hot, just wore out, thirsty. God, can't you come and provide for us? I'm going to back up to chapter 25, verse 1. and read this entire section so you can get the sense of it. O Lord, you are my God. I will exalt you. I will praise your name, for you have done wonderful things. Plans formed of old, faithful and sure. You have made the city a heap, the fortified city a ruin. The palace of aliens is a city no more. It will never be rebuilt. Therefore, strong peoples will glorify you. Cities of ruthless nations will fear you. For you have been our refuge to the poor, a refuge to the needy in their distress, a shelter from the rainstorm and a shade from our heat. Now go back and listen to what he's saying there. He's saying that when God has finally intervened and destroyed our destroyer cities, when he has destroyed the Babylonians or the Assyrians or whoever happens to be our oppressor right now, and we're able to go back home, then we will be able to sing this song, that God has been a refuge to us, the poor, a shelter in the rainstorm. He has been our guide when the heat was blasting us. He was a shelter for us. Verse 5, the noise of aliens or foreign people, like dry heat in a dry place. You have subdued that heat with the shade of clouds. In other words, you've taken us away from the noise of the foreigners. The song of the ruthless was stilled. They used to sing songs whenever they were victorious, but when these people are overthrown and we are released from our exile, they won't sing those songs over us anymore. You will have vindicated us. On this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a rich feast of food, a feast of well-aged wine, a rich food filled with marrow, well-aged wine strained clear, and he will destroy on this mountain the shroud that has been cast over his people. The sheet that is spread over the nations, he will swallow up death forever, and the Lord will wipe away the tears from our faces, and the disgrace of his people will he take away from the earth, for the Lord has spoken it. The disgrace of the people is when their foreign enemies came in and took them over. They were disgraced. They had their eyes full of tears. Their family members had just been slaughtered, their kids. They were carted off to Egypt or to Exodus and exile, to Babylon. This is a cry for God to intervene and to bring us from a place of exile out of his presence and back to our own land, to the temple. And they use symbolism to make that connection. You have given us shade from the heat of foreign people's words that they used against us. That was like dry heat on us. It was a burden. It was just unrelenting, and it was just overwhelming. We couldn't take it anymore. But you've given us shade from that. We were hungry. We were thirsty. But you've provided for us a shepherd like Moses, in this instance, Jesus, the great shepherd who will guide us to water, right? And Jesus in the New Testament, if you remember, was with a woman who was at the well. And she said, or he said to her, give me some water. And she said, if you knew I was a Samaritan and you're a Jew, you wouldn't ask me for water. And he says, if you knew who I was, you would ask me for living water. And that's what he says here in verse 17, the Lamb, Jesus, the shepherd. See, the Lamb, ironically, here is also the shepherd. He's a shepherd to guide us to the springs of water of life, living waters. And like in Isaiah 25 and verse 8, God himself will wipe away the tears and our shame that the earth and the people that are against God have put on us, the mocking, the ridicule, the imprisonment, the beatings, the murders, the martyrdoms, whatever the case may be. God will bring us through that unscathed, even if we die. In eternity, we'll be with God. Now, I don't usually go into another chapter, but I need to for just one last thing that I want to say to set up next week's Bible study. So chapter 8 and verse 1. When the Lamb opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for half an hour. And I saw the seven angels who stood before God, and seven trumps were given to them. We'll stop right there. That's the only two verses I want to talk about this week. We're going to get right back into that next week, but I want to say this. Remember, we said that these things are cycles of judgment that seem to be the same set of 7 judgments. If that's the case, and it does seem to be the case for me at least, you may disagree with me and we can agree to disagree, and that's okay. But if that is the case, it makes sense, because when the 7th seal is open, what you expect is for all judgment to end. If this is the judgment of God, and there's 7 seals that represent the 7 judgments God's going to pour out, then when the people in chapter 6 and the end of chapter 6 say, hide us from the face of the one who's sitting on the throne, judgment is here, and who can stand before God? And God says, before that judgment actually happens, stop. Mark all of my people on their forehead. And all the people that are marked start rejoicing and worshiping God, and a whole liturgy of worship service breaks out. And then we go back to opening up the seal, and the 7th one opens, and you think God's going to get them. And instead, God has 7 angels stand before him, and the 7th seal is open. The scroll is now laid bare. It's completely open. But there's 7 angels that are given 7 trumpets, and the trumpets begin to sound again. And here's one of the keys that kind of helps you to know. Later, when we get to it, we will see. If I can find it real quick. I may not be able to find it. Oh, I'm not going to be able to find it right offhand, and I don't want to keep you in awkward silence for these few moments. You're going to find, though, in chapter 9 or 10, I can't find it right now, but a plague is going to be poured out on the sun, where part of the sun will be darkened and part of the moon will also be darkened in this trumpet that will be sound. Oh, me. Really would like to find that for you. There it is in chapter 8, actually, in verse 12. The 4th angel who blows his trumpet. When he does, a third part of the sun was struck, and a third part of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that they didn't shine their light. And a third of the day was kept from shining, and likewise the night. Now, again, I'm going to suggest that this is symbolic, but if it is different, and if it's supposed to be literal, like some people suggest, go back to chapter 6. Chapter 6, when the 6th seal was open, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth, and full moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky have fallen. So if all the stars have already fallen out of the sky, and the sun has already turned black, and the moon has already turned blood, then if these are not the same 7 judgments just told in a different way, in a cyclical kind of way, and if these are not symbolic, if they're in fact literal, like some people try to suggest, the sun is already darkened, the moon is already bloody, and there are no stars left. But the 4th trumpet, when we're going to get to next week, says that the third part of the sun is blotted out. Well, it's already been blotted out. And a third part of the moon has been blotted out. Well, it's already turned to blood. And a third of the stars fall from heaven. Well, they already fallen. All of it already fallen, apparently. So again, I don't think these are literal. I think they're symbolic, and I think he's trying to say something about how the earth, like even creation itself, is sort of cataclysmically affected by God's judgment. Great fires, earthquakes, tsunamis, tornadoes, hurricanes, plagues. Things happen that affect this earth. And, as humans, we've always seen this as like, if God is all powerful, then God must be using these things in some way. How is he using these to get our attention, or what's going on here? And that seems to be what's being said here. It's like when God actually intervenes, there may be a literal earthquake, or it may just seem like the whole world is shook up. Maybe it's symbolic and saying that God is shaking things up. So we've kind of come to a close for tonight's Bible study. I won't keep you any longer, but I did want to just highlight chapter 8 starts with the opening of the 7th seal, which should be the end, but yet it all of a sudden begins again. And again, if this is the way that many scholars have read this, and it's symbolic and it's about how God judges every generation, even when Hitler rose up and Stalin and Mussolini and the dictators and the totalitarian regimes, Tojo in Japan, God was with God's people. God was with the people who stood on the side of right during those time frames. And yes, there was violence and there was war and there was bloodshed, and it seemed like the earth was shaken and the heavens were, the stars were falling and things like that, because it was world war. It was horrible. But in all of that, God poured out the judgments on the wicked people. The good people won. Stalin lost. Tojo lost. Hitler lost. The good people of the world prevailed. And God does this time and time and time and time again, until at the very end, when God says there will be no more time, and all time kind of comes to a close. Okay, let's stop there for tonight, and we'll pick up on chapter 8 on next week's Bible study. I hope that each and every one of you are doing well, and I hope that these studies are very beneficial to you and you enjoy them as much as I enjoy doing them for you and with you. I hope that this time of us being separated from our physical proximation in each other's presence is not a time for you to be separated from your discipleship and your desire to continue to learn about God and God's word and how it speaks to us today. All right. I hope that you have a good rest of your week, and I will see you on Wednesday night when we do our regular Bible studies, or our prayer requests. See you on Wednesday night.